Because the thing I'd really, really like people to take away from this conversation is the scale and the pace of change that's required. So the reduction in carbon emissions that the UK government's expecting from the transport sector, or from the domestic transport sector, so taking out international aviation and shipping over the next 16 years to 2037. Emissions from domestic transport need to fall by around 34 to 45% by 2030 and 65 to 76% by 2035 relative to 2019 levels. So 2035 is 14 years away, and we're looking at a 65 to 76% fall in emissions against what we're doing in 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic. Now that's huge. That's just a huge change. It's not incremental change. It's just fundamental, radical change. And that, if nothing else, that's the biggest message I think people need to take away from Build Back Greener.
Welcome to CIHT podcasts.
Glasgow will soon be host to the Conference of Parties COP26 that starts in 10 days' time, as the world seeks to stabilise greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So in the run-up to this, just this week, the government published their net zero strategy, Build Back Greener. And from a transport perspective, this builds on the Department for Transport's Transport Decarbonisation Plan, launched this July. To explore what all this means for transport and the wider sector, I'm joined by Andrew Crudgington, CIHT's Climate Change Associate. Previously, he was Director of External Affairs and Head of Policy at the Institution of Civil Engineers. And in his role at CIHT, he is focused on supporting the profession to make a full contribution to delivering the UK's net zero target. So perhaps a good starting question is, what do we actually mean by net zero? Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thanks, Justin. Nice to be here. So I think the important thing with net zero, and this is probably a way of thinking about how big the challenge we're facing is that it's much more about the zero piece of that word than the net. So it's really about doing absolutely everything you possibly can, using all the available technologies to eliminate carbon, not just to reduce carbon, but to eliminate carbon. And only when you've made every reasonable effort using all those technologies, all those methods to eliminate as much carbon as possible, then and only then can you think about offsetting those emissions. Under net zero as well, those offsets need to be about removing carbon from the atmosphere. So it needs to be things like tree planting that will take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and not things like investing in renewable energy that will simply potentially reduce the amount of emissions being pumped out somewhere else. And I guess if you think about transportation, we are a sector who move a lot of people around, a lot of people and goods around in vehicles that are driven by the internal combustion engine. And we also build a lot of infrastructure that has a lot of carbon embedded in it, in its concrete and steel and its asphalt. So it really, really is a major radical change for the sector. And I don't think anyone should be thinking in terms of incremental change. This is fundamental.
I think we need to set why this is all important. The government's strategy on achieving net zero, the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, we need to set that all within a wider geopolitical context, and COP26 seems the most appropriate anchor that we've got. It's the biggest global meeting that the UK will host. It's happening in a couple of weeks. So could you just say what COP is actually?
Yeah, so as you mentioned earlier, Justin, it's the Conference of the Parties to, and essentially it's essentially every nation, all 197 nations who have signed up to the UN framework on climate change. Now, there is a COP meeting every year, but not every COP is equal. So this year's COP in Glasgow is particularly important because it's 5 years on, well, 5 years plus one because of COVID, from the Paris Agreement in 2015. And as part of that agreement, every country in the world agreed to come back in 5 years for a kind of stock take. So under the Paris Agreement, countries agreed to put in place to develop national plans, national contributions that would point everyone in the world towards the same goal of holding climate change down to below 2 degrees and ideally closer to 1.5 degrees. So what we've got in Glasgow, in some ways, is a sort of giant stock take, an opportunity for countries around the world to hold each other to account and scrutinise each other's plans and see if they are sufficient. The other thing that happens at COP is other parties, so businesses, NGOs, etc., will be there, and it's quite possible that announcements between, say, global motor manufacturers may well be made as well. But the core of COP26 is that stock take. So every government in the world bringing their equivalent of the Build Back Greener plan and allowing it to be scrutinised by all their peers.
It's probably worth just putting this in the context of sort of heat increases that have been happening across the globe since the pre-industrial era of since records been about 1 degree Celsius. So it might not sound much, 1 degree, but that extra heat has driven regional and seasonal temperature extremes and reduced snow and ice cover and intensified the heavy rainfall that we've seen. And I guess this year in Europe and wildfires. So that's why it's important. I think it's just worth just putting a caveat on why it's so important, because it's creating extremes of weather that we're struggling to live in. So
yeah, and I think one part of the COP mix which listeners might be interested in looking at is the latest scientific analysis from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is again essentially the UN body that brings together the world's leading climate scientists, and some of the analysis in there of the impact of a 1.5 to 2 degrees, 2.5, 3 degree increase in global temperatures, and how much that's already locked in. Some of that's quite frightening. Some of those things you just described look like a kind of an entree to a much more significant problem over the coming decades.
And can we look at the government's net zero strategy, Build Back Greener, now?
Of course.
From a transport perspective, what are the sort of headlines, and what should transport professionals have at the front of their mind when thinking about decarbonisation that's sort of outlined in that strategy? Yeah,
so again, I suppose I'll go back. I'll take the second one first. So, what should people have at the front of their mind? I guess, reiterating my earlier answer, this is about the kind of scale and the pace of change that's required. Because the thing I'd really, really like people to take away from this conversation is the scale and the pace of change that's required. So I'm looking at the moment, this is a terrible thing to do on a podcast, I'm looking at a graph. So I'm looking at a graph on page 154 of Build Back Greener. And that sets out an indicative domestic transport emissions pathway to 2037, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it essentially tells us the reduction in carbon emissions that the UK government's expecting from the transport sector, or from the domestic transport sector. So taking out international aviation and shipping over the next 16 years to 2037. So I'll just read this out. Actually, this is probably an indicative of the scale that we're looking at. So our potential pathway also indicates emissions from domestic transport need to fall by around 34 to 45% by 2030 and 65 to 76% by 2035 relative to 2019 levels. So 2035 is 14 years away, and we're looking at a 65 to 76% fall in emissions against what we're doing in 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic. Now that's huge. That's just a huge change. It's not incremental change. It's just fundamental, radical change. And that, if nothing else, that's the biggest message I think people need to take away from Build Back Greener. In terms of specifics for the sector, much of the detail that you see in Build Back Greener has been pre-announced in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, which came out from DFT back in July. And in some sense, Build Back Greener is a kind of combination of all the plans that have appeared or not appeared during the past 18 months for different sectors. So for those who've been following the debate, there aren't many new things. I guess the kind of top announceable in government speak is to take forward the commitment to end the sale of new petrol and diesel cars between 2030 and 2035, government have confirmed that they will introduce a zero emission vehicles mandate that will come into force from 2024, and that will effectively set manufacturers' targets for the percentage of their cars and van sales that should come from zero emission vehicles, and that'll be ratcheted up every year, and that has to be helpful for the sector because it starts to allow us to plan for the kind of scale and the pace of the rollout of the charging network that will be required to support that, and everything that goes alongside that.
And one thing that when it was announced, obviously there was the focus on particularly on electric vehicles, and that dominated one of the kind of messages that seemed to resonate after the strategy was launched about electrification. Obviously, there's the issue of people having concerns about not finding a charge point, perhaps, or range anxiety of a battery running out. I mean, where are we at with the charging infrastructure at the moment? Is there the sufficient infrastructure in place currently, or is there much more needed to support that kind of confidence that customers need to get in an electric vehicle?
Yeah, well, perhaps unhelpfully, the strategy on charging is still on the charging network is still to come, being promised for later in this year. So I can't really give you a full answer. I suppose what is true is that the government has acknowledged that more investments are required. So they put an upfront 620 million down, 620 million pounds to support the transition to electric vehicles, and that's been targeted on charging infrastructure for sort of local on-street residential charging. I think the interesting point is the government sees its role as stimulating the market to deliver the necessary infrastructure, and it draws attention fairly regularly to the kind of rapid decline in price of offshore and onshore wind as an example of where some government intervention, some government priming of a market can lead to kind of rapid decline in price of a technology and its rapid rollout. And I think it sees charging infrastructure in those terms. Now, whether it's put enough money down to stimulate the market to deliver the infrastructure required, and whether a purely market-led approach can iron out some of the sort of distributional issues of more charging infrastructure appearing in wealthier areas, or more charging infrastructure appearing in areas where there are semi-detached or detached houses who may already have off-street parking. I think that's an interesting one, and I'm sort of left saying only time will tell. But I think it's worth being a bit sceptical, and it's worth thinking about whether we'll need to make some more focused and targeted interventions to make sure this is the charging infrastructure really is extensive and available to everybody.
It's a fascinating and good point. That I mean, part of the challenge is to getting people to buy into what they need to do, and if they can't afford to, say, for instance, buy an electric car, then it's hard for them to buy into what they can't afford to do in terms of changing how they move around. So that inequality's sort of dimension to it. There was the HM Treasury's net zero review that looked at the economic implications of the push to net zero. What were the kind of key bits for you that were important from that?
Well, for me, there were two things there, and the first is this is that equity piece that you mentioned, and it's quite interesting. It's quite a complicated picture because the Treasury do believe that with the kind of stimulus that government's providing, the cost of electric vehicles should start to come down fairly rapidly, fairly quickly, and is an assumption that the kind of some of those range issues will be sorted out by the scale of demand in the market, unlocking the business case for making investments in technology that can deal with that. But there is a kind of time lag issue there. So over the next say 4 or 5 years, the expectation is that those who can most afford to switch to electric vehicles will be the early adopters, and that in equity terms seems right because these are this is the kind of burden of change falling on those most able to bear it. But of course, in that interim period, if the kind of measures that are being introduced mean that the cost of running a petrol or diesel vehicle continue to rise, and ownership of those vehicles is concentrated in the poorest parts of the community, then I think there's some quite interesting trade-offs to be made between sort of targeting support at those people and trying to shift them pretty rapidly to electric or to zero emission vehicles. And yeah, I don't think that's kind of purely a sort of policy or a technocratic question. One for experts to look at kind of tables and sort of tweak incentive structures. I think if we get that wrong, we saw what happened a couple of weeks ago when people couldn't get petrol. We're several hours away from a riot in several parts of southern England, and you can imagine that the political consequences and the support for the transition could start to wither pretty quickly if we get that kind of thing wrong. I think the second area that the Treasury paper highlighted, I think it's worth people thinking about. It's not a new one, I'm sure, to any listeners of this podcast, but clearly as we move to zero emission vehicles, the tax take from fuel duty will decline rapidly to zero over the next decade or so, and the Treasury rightly point out this leaves a big hole in the roads fund, and it raises questions about how we fund future infrastructure. And while the Treasury don't come out directly and mention the words road user charging, I think you can sort of read an implication that there's certainly a willingness in at least that part of government to consider road user charging or other new mechanisms for funding highways infrastructure. And I guess, of course, the benefits of road user charging in the context of net zero is it's also a demand management mechanism. And as I'm sure we're going to come to, alongside making a kind of tech fix to our vehicles, we do need to think about behaviour change and reducing our reliance on domestic, on making many journeys in cars and vans.
I was going to ask that. You used the word technocratic, and did you feel that the net zero strategy was overtly, and also the Department for Transport Decarbonisation plan, that they were just offering up a technocratic solution, or were they broader than that?
It's quite an interesting document, the Transport Decarbonisation plan, because if you read the foreword and you read the content of the plan itself, and there's a bit of this in the Build Back Greener as well, you might not think it was the same document. So in the foreword to the Transport Decarbonisation plan, there are words like, this is not about stopping doing anything. It's all about doing things differently. But it's very clear when you read the detail that government does acknowledge that you can't get to net zero simply by electrifying the vehicle fleet, and that essentially we need to do everything. And by doing everything, I mean, we need to look at behaviour change, and there's quite a significant amount of behaviour change in the analysis behind the pathway to that 65 to 70% reduction in emissions that I mentioned earlier. So in the plan, in the decarbonisation plan, and reconfirmed in Build Back Greener, there's actually quite a bit of money being put into buses, billions, a couple of billion going into the national bus strategy as previously announced, and a reconfirmation of that, a couple of billion going into cycling and walking as part of an active travel piece. But I do think it's unhelpful that government is perhaps sending out mixed messages here. It would be much better if they had the difficult conversation with the public, the difficult and possibly vote-losing conversation with the public. So it's a big ask. That does make it clear that if we're going to hit these goals, behaviour needs to change quite fundamentally. We need to make less journeys, if at all possible, in cars and vans. We need to shift modes, and we need to walk and cycle more. And there are targets for that. There's a target for 50% of journeys within towns and cities to be by walking and cycling by, I think it's 2030, maybe 2035, but relatively short order. But obviously those have been dialed down in the messaging, which I don't think is very helpful. If we simply sort of bring down the cost of running an electric vehicle to the same sort of marginal cost of making a journey in a petrol or diesel vehicle, we're going to have the same congestion problems and some of the kind of air quality and quality of life issues in cities and towns that go with that we've got already, which just seems like a massive missed opportunity to me. Let alone making it more difficult for us actually to hit those net zero goals.
As a final question, what do you think that people need to do individually through a transport lens, from a transport perspective, both in their personal and their professional life, perhaps giving one thing to do on both of those areas, one thing professionally and one thing personally? What would your advice be to people?
So I'll start with the professionally. And if we're talking about individual transport professionals, I mentioned earlier that, if you're going to make progress, as a business towards net zero, you need to kind of have a baseline. So you need to understand your kind of current emissions and have a robust plan to bring those down in line with that goal of keeping warming down to 1.5 degrees. So if you take that analogy, I think individual transportation professionals need to do a kind of baseline audit of their own knowledge, skills, awareness, competency to understand where they are in relation to this challenge. Because to me, this looks like the biggest challenge that this generation of professionals will face. So if you don't know the baseline of where you are and you don't start creating a plan, which I guess means a kind of CPD plan for most people to get you to where you need to be, I think you're missing out, and I think you'll probably make your career quite difficult, because this is only going to ramp up over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So that's the first thing I do for a transportation professional: just audit myself, reflect on my job role, reflect on those all those targets and objectives that we've been talking about in this conversation, and work out from there what my plan is to kind of fill any gaps I have in knowledge, awareness, skills, competence. And of course, CIHT is there to help you in that, and we're working very hard on making sure that we've got all the support in place to get members to where they need to be. I guess in terms of individual behaviour, it's really very hard, because obviously everyone's context is differently. But I guess it's the kind of avoid, shift, improve mantra. So when you're thinking about your journeys, do I need just ask that question? Do I need to make these journeys? Can I shift it to another mode? Can I improve? Can I improve the kind of carbon efficiency of what I'm doing by changing my car or my van?
And obviously, one positive out of COVID, if there is any, is people embracing digital connectivity, maybe more so than they ever have. So perhaps that's something that people can think about as well going forward, about how we connect. But well, thank you. I mean, that was great. Thank you for your time. That was an interview with Andrew Crudgington, CIHT's Climate Change Associate. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Justin.